our experience and what we're seeing in the market, and again, going back to what we talked about, is kind of these, how do we take companies that are born digital and how do we adopt a similar strategy? We're not going to necessarily become the next Amazon, but really, what are the learnings? Because if you look at the context of what platform-based business models and kind of digitally natively born businesses have is, first of all, platforms are the center of their business. And secondly, it allows them to come to market very fast or capture market opportunities very fast. It allows them to transition across markets very fast. And it allows them to become a key stakeholder within the value chain in the markets that they play, because many of the value chain is reliant on their platform because of how it creates value across those stakeholders. So whether it's customers or partners or our own employees. And so it's a very powerful position. So if we can take that same philosophy and we can bring that into traditional businesses, it really changes the value that technology can play within the utility industry. And so we believe platforms and a platform strategy is the key. And it's been proven in multiple markets, and we see the opportunity with utilities, and we're seeing it with our own customers.
That's great. Hey, Bala, can you give us a little bit more perspective on what a platform or a platform strategy is?
Right, Bill. So I think why platforms, right? I think we talked about disruption, we talked about growth, then we talked about ecosystems. So it's a chain of disruptions in the utilities, right? So if you have to brace yourself to this disruption, right? Obviously, I think as everyone talks about, it's digital transformation. It's a very commonly used sort of phenomenon, right? And there are 100 different connotations of digital, but I think what Matt, I think you would have seen this as well, right? CXOs and CEOs and the boards are really struggling with is there a meaningful approach for digital transformation, right? It's not really a right or a wrong approach. So when you really talked about platforms, so this is another very common connotation. A platform is just not a technology backbone, right? So we are saying that, look at the born digital companies, right? Matt, you talked about an Amazon, right? Why have they been so successful? I was also talking about examples of one of the largest taxi companies. They don't own a taxi, but they are still, I think, one of the largest. So platforms are the secret sauce, we think, for born digital companies. So how do traditional companies really embrace platform principles, right? So that is the approach that we talk about as platform thinking. And if you really talk about platforms, they are an embodiment of about 5 principles. One is, I think we've already talked about it. They create value leveraging the ecosystem, right? Second one, ability to rapidly create digital services. You see most of the born digital businesses rapidly creating digital services and experiences for customers based on customer preferences across channels, right? The third one, I think, that you typically see platform companies really establishing is able to scale pretty fast. Of course, from a technology perspective, I think most of these businesses are cloud-based businesses. So obviously, scale is an imperative there. But it's just not about technology. It's also about of building rapid, scalable business models, as you have seen most of these guys really talking about. And of course, the fourth and the fifth one is really about data and then creating a connected sort of an ecosystem, right? I know most of us are customers of an Amazon or sort of a platform businesses like Uber. I think the customer experience that we sort of experience as part of an ecosystem is simply made possible because of the intelligent use of data by the platform, which essentially means that the platform in itself is self-learning and intelligent and harnesses the data to create unique experiences for customers, right? So we are saying that with the emergence of ecosystems, right, with the emergence of or with the dissemination of the industry walls, traditional companies, including utility companies, will have to take a platform approach. And then we've sort of looked at an industry platform construct, a very simple construct to essentially understand the manifestation of what would be a platform, a business construct in every industry segment. right? Before we get into what it means to utilities, let's understand what this construct is. The construct essentially has three layers to it. One is it has the value layer, or essentially what we can call as the ecosystem layer, right? Is what is your ecosystem, right? The second layer is, if you know what your ecosystem is, how can you activate your ecosystem? How can you digitize your ecosystem? Or how can you create interactions in your ecosystem and value from your ecosystem, right? And of course, the third one is, if you're able to activate your ecosystem, and how could you create services for your customers? How could you create newer services for your customers? So which is really about downstream services for your customers. So let's apply this to the utility industry segment and see how does a platform sort of a thinking manifest into an industry construct for utilities, right? The first one, of course, is the reimagine the business as an ecosystem, right? Which essentially means that it is not really about upstream, downstream, or upstream, midstream, and then downstream with power and energy flowing from the top to bottom. It's really about how do the stakeholders in this ecosystem contribute to a grid, and how can they optimize the peak demand, and how can they really create services from the ecosystem. So it's about energy management. It's about creating smart home platforms downstream. It's about smart metering. It's also probably a sort of a utility marketplace, right, down the lane. So that's about the ecosystem. Now, if you want to activate the ecosystem, what we are saying is dissect the ecosystem into a set of digital business processes, right? You could have many digital business processes, but predominantly the way we look at an industry construct, at least identify about 5 or 6 broad industry themes, right? Which you can double click into digital business processes, which can be leveraged to activate the ecosystem, which essentially means to digitize your ecosystem, create data, and then services from your ecosystem, right? From a perspective of utilities, I think reimagining the grid or digitizing the grid, I think, is a key a digital business process ecosystem that we are looking at. We are looking at asset as a life cycle management. I think we talked about the asset light model. I think this is a key digital business process. I think that that utility companies need to focus on. Apart from that, I think work management, of course, bring in more efficiencies, bring in much more productivity into the entire work cycle and the field services, right? Needless to say, customer engagement. I was talking about a lot about it downstream, how consumers are becoming prosumers and all that. But then what takes the cake really is about beyond utilities, right? Can you really create newer digital processes that can rapidly create services for your consumers and empower them and make them contribute to the grid? I think that's where the game-changing propositions that utility companies can adopt to completely up the ante. So once you create the digital business process, the third one, of course, needless to say, I mean, if you don't have a technology, sort of a very robust technology infrastructure and a platform to enable this, to enable the activation of the ecosystem, right? So we typically look at a 16-point technology framework or characteristics. We've highlighted about 5 or 6 key characteristics. I typically call them, Matt, as the who's who of the digital characteristics, right? And especially for something like utilities where everything is getting consumerized, right? Self-services, scalable model, and APIs and microservices, I think, are a no-brainer today. Right? They're actually becoming table stakes for a lot of companies which want to create this self-healing structures and newer services for consumers. Data, needless to say again, right? So fundamentally, I think to completely reimagine and relook, right, and reboot your enterprise in terms of value creation and in terms of creating newer experiences for customers, it's all about understanding and designing your ecosystem, synthesizing them into digital process, and then having a very unique digital platform architecture that can enable the ecosystem and the processes. Matt, are there any examples that you have seen maybe in the utility side from the last 6 months that you've been interacting with some of the CXOs where you see a manifestation of this sort of a construct?
I think it's more about the conversations we're having and how utilities are looking at the realization of this, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So the example is that if we're looking at modernizing our ERP or enterprise asset management, work management, what you're seeing is within the plan side of things is starting to see more of this outside in kind of perspective, so they're starting to really think about the different stakeholders. And obviously these are those that I would say are more on the mature side of things. But what's naturally happening is this shift of this very linear process to this very nonlinear way of thinking. I think the challenge that we're seeing is that how do we execute on that, and how do we prioritize? And so that's kind of what we're seeing, in the market, and much of what we're seeing out there with our customers today. Obviously, some are well down this path. They've fully architected and designed, and in some cases have implemented their ecosystem, and now they're simply looking at how do we improve on that and bring new services to market and new stakeholders into our ecosystem.